A new beginning. Beth's heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness as she glanced in the rearview mirror. Seated in the back of the car was Angela, her new daughter, whom they had recently adopted from an overseas orphanage. Angela, a quiet girl with a shy demeanor and wide, expressive eyes, had hardly spoken during the journey home. Beth tried to remember the counselor's advice from the adoption center. Give her time. Some children need longer to adjust, especially if they've experienced trauma. Beth's husband, Tom, glanced over, catching her worried look. She'll be fine, Beth. Just wait until she sees the room you've put together, he reassured her. As they pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, Beth felt a wave of relief. It was finally happening. They were a family now. She opened Angela's car door and held out her hand, hoping the young girl would take it. With a slight hesitation, Angela wrapped her small fingers around Beth's, her grip tighter than expected. Together, they walked toward the front door. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Beth whispered, turning the key and opening the door to Angela's new life. Stepping into the warm and inviting entryway, Angela's gaze flicked across the room, taking in the comfortable blue couch, the family photos on the wall, and the soft, cream-colored tones that filled the space. Her eyes widened slightly, her small hand still clinging tightly to Beth's. Tom carefully picked up Angela's purple suitcase and headed toward the stairs. "Let's show you your room," he said, smiling gently as he climbed. Angela followed slowly, one step at a time, her hand grazing the polished wooden banister as though she were memorizing its feel. Beth's heart swelled as she watched the young girl take in every detail with quiet wonder. "Here we are," Beth announced, pushing open the door to Angela's new bedroom. She had spent weeks preparing this space, painting the walls a bright, sunny yellow, and filling it with cozy bedding, plush toys, and a bookshelf brimming with picture books. In the center of the room was a large window with white curtains that billowed slightly in the afternoon breeze. Angela stepped inside and paused, her gaze darting from the bed to the bookshelf to the little stuffed animals that sat patiently on her pillows, waiting to welcome her. For a long moment, she stood there, unmoving, as if the sight of it all was too overwhelming to process. But then, a slight smile softened her face, and her grip on Beth's hand loosened. "That's your bed, Angela," Beth said softly, crouching down to her level. "All yours." Angela didn't respond, but her fingers brushed across the bedspread, feeling the soft texture beneath her fingertips. Her expression was inscrutable, a mix of curiosity, caution, and something else that Beth couldn't quite decipher. The rest of the day passed in a comfortable rhythm. Beth and Tom showed Angela the rest of the house, the cozy kitchen, where they would soon cook meals together, the living room with its inviting blue couch, and the backyard with a small swing set. Angela observed everything in silence, her wide eyes taking in every detail. But she remained silent. As the evening approached, Beth and Tom decided it was time to settle in for the night. Angela's bedtime routine was simple, and Beth was surprised by how easily Angela fell into the rhythm of their home. After brushing her teeth, Angela changed into the new pajamas Beth had picked out for her. She seemed to relax slightly, her shoulders loosening as she curled up under the covers of her new bed. Beth sat beside her on the bed and began reading a bedtime story. She picked a colorful picture book about a family of animals going on an adventure. Angela's gaze never left the pages, her dark eyes wide with fascination, yet she still remained silent. Beth paused for a moment, wondering if she should ask Angela about her thoughts. But remembering the counselor's advice, she decided to wait. As she closed the book and tucked Angela in, she whispered, "Good night, Angela." Angela gazed up at her, her expression thoughtful. For a moment, Beth thought she might say something, but the girl simply closed her eyes, curling up under the blankets. Beth turned off the light and tiptoed out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. In the hallway, Tom was waiting, his expression mirroring the mix of emotions Beth felt. "She's a quiet one," he remarked, glancing back at the closed door. "But she'll open up. We just need to give her time." Beth nodded, though a small knot of worry tugged at her heart. She knew that adjusting to a new family would take time, but there was something in Angela's silence that seemed different. It wasn't the silence of a shy child, but something deeper, almost guarded. Over the next few days, Beth and Tom tried their best to make Angela feel comfortable in her new home. They took her on little trips around the neighborhood, introducing her to the park down the street and the local ice cream shop. Beth would hold Angela's hand as they walked, and though the girl remained mostly quiet, there were moments when her face lit up with a smile, like when she tasted strawberry ice cream for the first time or watched a group of children playing in the park. But despite these small victories, Angela's silence lingered. She was polite, even affectionate, but there was an unspoken distance between her and the world around her. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, Beth noticed Angela watching her intently from the kitchen table. She was holding a crayon and a piece of paper, drawing small, careful shapes. Beth smiled and waved, but Angela's expression remained serious, as if she were studying her every move. Beth tried to engage her in conversation. "What are you drawing, Angela?" Angela looked down at the paper and, after a moment, held it up. It was a simple drawing, a house with a tree next to it, and two people holding hands. Beth's heart softened. "Is that us?" she asked, pointing to the figures. Angela hesitated, then nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. As the days passed, Angela's silence began to shift. She started pointing at objects around the house, her eyes expectant, as if asking for the words. Beth realized this was her way of learning to communicate, and she eagerly played along, naming each item and encouraging Angela to repeat after her. "Table," Beth said, patting the kitchen table. "Table," Angela whispered, her voice barely audible but clear. "Book," Beth said one evening as she handed Angela a storybook. "Book," Angela repeated, her pronunciation careful and precise. Every small word she picked up felt like a victory, a step closer to unlocking the quiet world Angela seemed to inhabit. Beth's heart soared each time Angela spoke, even if it was just a single word. By the end of the first week, Angela's vocabulary had grown impressively. She could say simple words like sandwich, chair, and bath. Tom, who often worked from home, would watch with pride as Angela copied letters in her notebook while he made sandwiches in the kitchen. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Beth first sensed something unusual. Angela had been practicing her letters, carefully tracing them in her notebook, when she looked up and said, "Mom." Beth's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected Angela to call her that so soon, but the sound of it filled her with a warmth she couldn't describe. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Angela paused, her gaze suddenly intense. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it again, her face unreadable. Beth felt a pang of unease. There was something about the way Angela looked at her, something searching, almost haunted. For a moment, Beth wondered what secrets lay hidden behind those dark, thoughtful eyes. She brushed the thought away, reminding herself that Angela had come from a difficult background and needed time to adjust. But as she looked down at her daughter's face, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that Angela's silence held something deeper, something she couldn't yet understand. In that moment, Beth realized that her journey as Angela's mother would be more complex than she'd ever imagined. Unseen shadows. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains of Angela's bedroom, casting golden light across her sleeping form. Beth stood in the doorway, watching her daughter's peaceful expression and feeling a surge of love mixed with a trace of uncertainty. Despite the warmth and security they'd surrounded her with, Angela's silence lingered, a quiet presence in their home. Today was a big day for Angela. It was her first day at the local elementary school. She'd be joining a classroom where she could play and learn with other children her age. Beth hoped the social environment would help Angela grow more comfortable with speaking English, and maybe even open up in ways she hadn't yet done at home. Beth gently nudged her shoulder, and Angela's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at Beth, who gave her a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart. Are you ready for your big day?" Angela's gaze drifted away for a moment before she nodded slightly. She rose from her bed, moving quietly as she prepared herself for the day. Beth watched her, a sense of pride welling up. Angela was an independent child, and her movements were careful and precise, as though she were used to taking care of herself. After breakfast, they drove to the school. Beth held Angela's hand as they walked toward the large brick building, her heart pounding with anticipation. Angela's face was unreadable, her gaze fixed ahead, but Beth could feel the tension in her small hand. "Remember, you can tell me if anything is bothering you, okay?" Beth whispered as they reached the classroom door. Angela nodded, but she still didn't speak. The teacher, Miss Harper, greeted them warmly and crouched down to Angela's level, offering her a reassuring smile. "Welcome, Angela. We're so excited to have you here," Miss Harper said, reaching out her hand. Angela hesitated but shook it, her small hand disappearing in Miss Harper's gentle grip. The other children watched curiously, some waving or offering shy smiles. Beth noticed Angela's gaze darting around the room, assessing every face, every movement, as though cataloging her surroundings. Beth felt a small twinge of sadness. It was the look of a child who had learned to stay on guard. With a final hug, Beth left, glancing back one last time. Angela was seated at a desk, her dark eyes fixed on the teacher as she introduced her to the class. Beth sighed, hoping that today would be a good day. The hours passed slowly for Beth, who busied herself with chores at home, frequently glancing at the clock. At last, it was time to pick up Angela. She arrived at the school and found Angela waiting outside, clutching her backpack tightly. Her expression was calm, but there was a tension in her posture that made Beth's heart tighten. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Beth asked as they walked to the car. Angela was quiet for a moment before looking up, her eyes flickering with an emotion Beth couldn't place. "Fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was one of the few complete words Angela had spoken to her, and Beth felt a surge of excitement. She held Angela's hand, silently hoping this was a sign of progress. At home, Angela spent the evening quietly drawing in her notebook. Tom joined them at the dinner table, noticing the calm but distant look on Angela's face. "Did you make any friends today, Angela?" he asked, his tone gentle. Angela looked down, her fingers gripping her crayon tightly. She seemed to hesitate before nodding slightly. "That's wonderful," Beth said, trying to keep her tone light. "Do you remember their names?" Angela's gaze remained on her drawing as she whispered, "Lily and Aiden." Beth and Tom exchanged a surprised look. This was more than Angela had ever offered about her day. Encouraged, Beth asked, "What did you play with Lily and Aiden?" Angela hesitated, her eyes fixed on the page. After a moment, she whispered, "Hide and seek." There was something in her tone that made Beth pause. The words were spoken softly, almost reluctantly, as if the game had unsettled her. Beth noticed that Angela's hand trembled slightly, her grip on the crayon too tight. But when Beth opened her mouth to ask more, Angela closed her notebook and excused herself, retreating to her room without another word. Beth and Tom exchanged a glance, concern filling their eyes. Tom leaned forward, his voice low. "Do you think something happened today?" Beth shrugged, worry gnawing at her. "I don't know, Tom. She's been through so much, and maybe she's just adjusting. But did you see the way she looked when she mentioned hide and seek? It was as if, I don't know, as if it frightened her." They were both silent for a moment, the weight of their daughter's past heavy in the room. There was so much they didn't know, so much Angela hadn't yet told them, or perhaps didn't remember. Beth tried to shake off the feeling, convincing herself that it was simply a game, just another part of adjusting to her new life. Later that night, Beth decided to peek into Angela's room to say goodnight. As she opened the door, she saw Angela sitting cross-legged on the floor, a small flashlight illuminating her notebook. Beth watched as Angela carefully drew a series of small dark shapes, her face serious and intent. "Angela," Beth called softly, not wanting to startle her. Angela looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to calm. She closed the notebook quickly, as if she didn't want Beth to see. Beth noticed the tension in her daughter's shoulders, a subtle defensiveness that made her wonder what Angela was hiding. "I just wanted to say good night, sweetheart," Beth said, choosing not to ask about the drawing. She didn't want to push Angela further. Angela nodded, her gaze flickering to the notebook before she slipped it under her pillow. The next few days passed in much the same way. Angela would attend school, come home, and quietly retreat into her room, drawing in her notebook or practicing her English in whispers. Beth noticed that Angela had become particularly attached to one of her stuffed animals, a small brown bear they'd bought her on her first trip to the toy store. She clung to it at night, holding it tightly as though it provided a sense of security. Then, one evening, as Beth was cleaning up after dinner, she noticed something unusual. Angela's notebook lay open on the table, the pages filled with drawings. Beth's curiosity got the better of her, and she glanced at the sketches. What she saw sent a chill down her spine. The drawings were intricate but unsettling, a series of dark shapes huddled together, almost shadowy figures looming over a small, lonely child. In each picture, the child was hiding, curled up in a corner or behind an object, her face partially obscured. Beth felt a wave of nausea as she flipped through the pages. The last drawing showed the small child staring directly at the viewer, her eyes wide with a silent scream. There was something deeply haunting about it, as though Angela was trying to express something too painful to say aloud. "What are you doing, Mom?" Angela's quiet voice startled Beth, and she quickly closed the notebook, turning to see her daughter standing in the doorway. "Oh, sweetheart, I was just tidying up," Beth stammered, feeling guilty for invading Angela's privacy. Angela's expression was calm, but there was a hardness in her gaze that Beth hadn't seen before. She walked over, her small hand reaching out to take the notebook from Beth's hands. Without a word, she slipped it back under her pillow and climbed into bed. "Good night, Angela," Beth whispered, but Angela didn't respond. She turned over, clutching her stuffed bear, her shoulders stiff. That night, Beth lay awake, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Angela's silence than she'd realized. She thought back to the adoption process, remembering how the agency had mentioned that Angela's background was largely unknown. They'd assured Beth and Tom that she was a healthy, intelligent child, but there had been no information about her life before the orphanage. What if something happened to her? Beth whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. Tom, who lay beside her, squeezed her hand. "We'll figure it out. She's our daughter now, and we'll do whatever it takes to help her." Beth nodded, comforted by his presence, but her heart was still heavy. She had a daughter who spoke only in whispers, who clung to her silence as though it were a shield. And now, with the unsettling drawings and Angela's guarded behavior, Beth felt as if they were standing on the edge of a mystery that ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. As she lay in the dark, Beth made a silent promise. No matter what Angela's past held, she would protect her, even if it meant uncovering the shadows that Angela kept hidden away. The whispered passed. Beth awoke to the quiet hum of morning. She lay in bed for a few minutes, her mind already spinning with thoughts of Angela. The drawing she had seen the previous night lingered in her mind like shadows, unsettling yet impossible to ignore. Beth couldn't shake the feeling that Angela's art held secrets about her past, memories she had either forgotten or couldn't yet articulate. After making breakfast, she went to Angela's room and gently knocked. When there was no answer, she opened the door and found her daughter already awake, sitting on her bed with her stuffed bear nestled in her arms. Angela looked up, her dark eyes meeting Beth's with a quiet intensity. "Good morning, sweetheart," Beth said softly, approaching the bed. Angela didn't respond but gave a small nod. Beth sat down beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Angela, She began, trying to choose her words carefully. "I wanted to ask you about your drawings. They're very interesting. Do you want to tell me what they mean?" Angela's gaze drifted down, her fingers clutching her bear a little tighter. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly, and Beth felt a pang of sadness. It was clear that Angela wasn't ready to open up about whatever was haunting her. "Okay, sweetheart," Beth said gently, stroking Angela's hair. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. But just know, I'm here to listen whenever you're ready." Angela relaxed slightly, leaning into Beth's side. They sat there in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. That afternoon, Beth decided to reach out to the adoption agency. Perhaps there was more information available about Angela's past than they had initially shared. She sat at her desk, typing an email to their adoption coordinator, Ms. Riley, explaining her concerns about Angela's silence and the unsettling drawings. To Beth's surprise, she received a reply within an hour. Ms. Riley's response was vague but suggested a meeting at her office to discuss the matter in person. Beth's stomach twisted with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Was there something they hadn't been told? A piece of Angela's history that could explain her guarded behavior? She scheduled a meeting for the following day and decided not to mention it to Tom just yet. She didn't want to raise any alarm until she had more concrete information. That evening, as she and Tom put Angela to bed, Beth noticed her daughter's hand trembling slightly as she clutched her bear. She wanted to ask Angela if something was bothering her, but she decided against it, not wanting to push her too hard. The next morning, Beth drove to the adoption agency, her heart pounding. She arrived at the small brick building, her mind racing with questions. Ms. Riley greeted her warmly, but with a hint of concern in her eyes. They walked together to her office, a cozy room lined with shelves of adoption files and family photos. Ms. Riley closed the door and gestured for Beth to sit. Beth took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I received your email, and I want to thank you for reaching out," Ms. Riley began, her voice calm but serious. "Angela is a wonderful child, and I'm glad to hear she's doing well in your care. However, there is something sensitive about her past that we didn't fully explain during the adoption process." Beth's stomach tightened. She leaned forward, listening intently. Ms. Riley took a deep breath before continuing. "Angela was found abandoned at a young age, and she spent several years in an orphanage overseas before coming to us. There were unusual reports about her behavior, quietness, intense attachment to certain objects, reluctance to speak with others. The orphanage staff mentioned that she often spoke in whispers to herself, though they couldn't understand what she was saying. At first, they thought she was just shy, but there were incidents that led them to believe she might have witnessed or experienced something traumatic." Beth's heart sank as she absorbed the information. She thought back to Angela's quiet demeanor, the way she clung to her stuffed bear, and the strange drawings she kept hidden. Was it possible that her daughter had endured something no child should ever experience? "There's more," Ms. Riley continued, her expression grave. When the orphanage staff tried to comfort her or ask her questions, Angela would become visibly distressed. She'd hide or withdraw, as if she were afraid of revealing too much. They suspected she had been taught not to speak openly about certain things. However, they never found out why. Beth felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think she was threatened?" Ms. Riley hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We don't have enough information to say for certain. It's possible that she was exposed to something traumatic and that silence became a way of coping. But we don't know who might have taught her to be silent or why." Beth felt tears prick at her eyes as she imagined the horrors her daughter might have faced. She looked down, a wave of helplessness washing over her. "Is there anything we can do to help her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Therapy might be a good start," Ms. Riley suggested gently. "It's possible that, over time, Angela will feel safe enough to open up, but it's also important to remember that healing will take time. She may need to confront her fears on her own terms, and that might not happen right away. Beth nodded, wiping away a tear. She felt a renewed determination to support Angela, no matter what it took. When Beth returned home, she found Angela playing quietly in the living room, her stuffed bear in her lap. She looked up as Beth entered, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. Beth knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her daughter in a gentle embrace. "I love you so much, Angela," she whispered, "and I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Angela's arms tightened around Beth, and for a moment, Beth thought she felt her daughter's body relax. But just as quickly, Angela pulled back, her face a blank mask once more. Later that night, as Angela slept, Beth shared everything with Tom. He listened quietly, his expression darkening as she recounted the details from Ms. Riley's meeting. When she finished, he let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe they didn't tell us sooner," he murmured, frustration evident in his voice. "Our poor little girl. No wonder she's so quiet. She's carrying secrets she's not ready to share." Beth nodded, her heart aching. "I think we should find a therapist for her, someone who specializes in trauma. It might help her feel safe enough to talk." Tom agreed, and they decided to reach out to a child psychologist recommended by the adoption agency. In the meantime, they resolved to create an environment where Angela felt safe, surrounded by love and patience. The following week, Beth and Tom introduced Angela to Dr. Whitmore, a gentle, soft-spoken child psychologist with kind eyes. She welcomed Angela into her office, which was filled with colorful toys and cozy cushions. Angela looked around cautiously, clutching her bear as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Dr. Whitmore spoke softly to Angela, explaining that she could play with any of the toys and that she didn't have to say anything she didn't want to. Angela listened quietly, her gaze shifting from Dr. Whitmore to Beth, and back again. She didn't speak, but she sat down on a cushion, holding her bear close as she began to explore the room with her eyes. Over the next few sessions, Angela began to engage in small ways. She would pick up toys, stack blocks, and sometimes draw with the crayons Dr. Whitmore provided. But she still didn't speak, and her drawings remained filled with dark, shadowy shapes. One afternoon, Dr. Whitmore called Beth into her office after a session. She showed Beth one of Angela's drawings, a picture of a small girl holding a stuffed bear, surrounded by tall, dark figures. "Angela seems to be expressing something significant through her art," Dr. Whitmore explained. "These figures could represent something she fears or has experienced in the past. It's possible she's drawing from memory, though we can't say for certain." Beth's heart ached as she looked at the drawing. She knew that Angela was hiding something painful, but she didn't want to push her too hard. Dr. Whitmore assured Beth that, with time and patience, Angela might feel safe enough to share her story. That night, as Beth tucked Angela into bed, she noticed her daughter's eyes lingering on the window. The curtains were drawn, but Angela's gaze remained fixed, a slight furrow in her brow. Beth sat beside her, stroking her hair gently. "Are you worried about something, Angela?" she asked softly. Angela looked at her, her eyes filled with an emotion Beth couldn't place. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, her face turning away. Beth leaned down and kissed her forehead, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe here. No one can hurt you." Angela's hand reached out, gripping Beth's tightly. In that moment, Beth felt the weight of all the secrets Angela held, the unspoken fears that haunted her young mind. As she left the room, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that Angela's past was closer than they realized, lurking in the shadows of her memories. She resolved to protect her daughter, no matter what secrets came to light. In her heart, she knew that their journey was just beginning, and that uncovering Angela's hidden past might reveal truths they were not yet prepared to face. Shadows in the night. As days turned into weeks, Angela continued her quiet adjustment to family life. Yet something still felt deeply unsettled. She became increasingly attached to her stuffed bear, clutching it tightly at night, almost as if it were a protective talisman. Beth and Tom tried to keep the household warm and comforting, hoping that stability would help Angela open up. But there were nights when they would hear faint whispers from her room, barely audible, as if she were speaking to the shadows themselves. One night, as Beth lay awake, she heard the whispers again, a soft, rhythmic murmuring that drifted from Angela's room down the hallway. Curiosity and concern mingling, Beth slipped out of bed and tiptoed toward her daughter's room, careful not to make a sound. She found Angela sitting up in bed, her face illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Her stuffed bear was tucked under one arm, and her gaze was fixed on the window. Angela's lips moved slowly, whispering words that Beth couldn't quite catch. Beth leaned closer, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. "Don't come," Angela murmured, her voice barely a breath. "I'm safe here." Beth's heart ached as she listened. Who was Angela talking to? Was it a memory, a figment of her past she couldn't shake? A chill ran down Beth's spine as she realized that Angela's fear was more deeply rooted than she'd thought. The next morning, Beth decided it was time to talk to Dr. Whitmore about Angela's nighttime whispers. She scheduled a call and sat in her car for privacy, while Angela played inside with Tom. When Dr. Whitmore picked up, Beth quickly explained the events of the previous night, trying to keep her voice steady. "Beth," Dr. Whitmore said gently, "it sounds like Angela may be reliving some kind of memory. It's common for children who have experienced trauma to have night terrors or flashbacks, especially if they haven't fully processed their past. The whispers you're hearing might be her way of talking to her past, of setting boundaries in her own mind." Beth nodded, clutching the phone tightly. "Is there anything we can do to help her with this? I feel so helpless." Dr. Whitmore's tone softened. "For now, continue providing the love and stability she needs. Let her know that you're there for her, even if she can't put her feelings into words yet. Over time, she may feel safe enough to share these memories with you directly." Beth thanked her, ending the call and sitting in silence, a new determination settling over her. She was ready to do whatever it took to help Angela overcome her fears, even if it meant facing shadows from a past she couldn't yet understand. That evening, Beth and Tom decided to have a quiet family night. They ordered pizza, put on a family movie, and cuddled up together on the couch. Angela sat between them, her small hand resting on Beth's arm, her stuffed bear clutched in her lap. As the movie played, Beth noticed Angela's gaze drifting to the shadows cast by the flickering television light. Her expression was far away, as if she were lost in another time and place. Beth gently placed an arm around her, pulling her close. "Everything's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, hoping the words would reach Angela's heart. Angela looked up, her dark eyes wide and searching. For a moment, Beth thought she saw a glimmer of trust, a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by a guarded look that Beth was beginning to recognize all too well. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Tom took Beth's hand. "Do you think we'll ever know what happened to her?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Beth sighed, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I don't know, Tom. But I believe that one day she'll trust us enough to tell us. Until then, we just have to be patient and show her that she's safe." Tom nodded, wrapping his arms around her. "We'll get through this. She's our daughter now, and we'll protect her no matter what." The next day, as Beth dropped Angela off at school, she noticed something strange. Angela hesitated at the classroom door, her grip on Beth's hand tightening. She looked up, her expression tense, her eyes flickering with a fear that Beth hadn't seen before. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Beth asked, kneeling down to look her in the eye. Angela's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but then she closed them again, her gaze shifting toward the classroom. She looked over her shoulder, as if checking for something or someone behind her. Beth's heart pounded, but she forced a smile. "You're safe, Angela. No one can hurt you here." Angela gave a small nod, her fingers releasing Beth's hand reluctantly as she walked into the classroom. Beth stayed at the door for a moment, watching as Angela took her seat, her eyes scanning the room. The look of suspicion on her face sent a chill through Beth. What was Angela so afraid of? That afternoon, when Beth picked Angela up from school, she noticed her daughter's demeanor had shifted again. Angela seemed unusually quiet, her face blank, her gaze distant. She clutched her stuffed bear as they walked to the car, holding it tightly to her chest. On the drive home, Beth decided to try a different approach. "Did something happen at school today, sweetheart?" Angela didn't respond, but her grip on the bear tightened. Beth could sense her daughter's tension, the way her small body was curled inward, as though she were trying to make herself invisible. When they got home, Angela went straight to her room, closing the door softly behind her. Beth followed, standing outside the door for a moment, her heart heavy with concern. She wanted to knock, to ask if Angela needed anything, but she held back, reminding herself that Angela needed space. A few minutes later, Beth heard faint murmurs coming from the other side of the door. She pressed her ear to the wood, straining to hear the words. "No, don't come. Stay away." Beth's breath caught. Angela's voice was filled with an intensity she hadn't heard before, a mix of fear and defiance. The words sent a chill down her spine, and she felt an overwhelming urge to protect her daughter from whatever shadows haunted her. That night, as Beth lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Angela's whispered words, the fear in her daughter's eyes, the guarded look that seemed to cling to her like a shadow. Beth knew there was more to Angela's past than they'd been told, and she feared that the secrets Angela held might be more dangerous than she'd imagined. Around midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. She sat up, her heart pounding, and saw Angela standing in the doorway, her bear clutched tightly to her chest. "Mom." Angela's voice was barely a whisper, her gaze uncertain. Beth's heart melted as she reached out her arms. "Come here, sweetheart." Angela hesitated, then slowly walked over, climbing into bed beside her mother. Beth wrapped her arms around her, holding her close, feeling the small tremors that ran through her daughter's body. After a moment, Angela whispered, Will they find me?" Beth's breath caught. She pulled Angela closer, stroking her hair gently. "No, sweetheart. No one will find you here. You're safe with us." Angela didn't respond, but her body slowly relaxed, her breathing evening out as she drifted into sleep. Beth lay awake, her mind racing. Who was Angela afraid of? And what had happened in her past that left her with this deep-seated fear? The following day, Beth decided to do some investigating on her own. She contacted Ms. Riley at the adoption agency, hoping she could provide more details about Angela's history. Ms. Riley was hesitant at first, but after a long conversation, she reluctantly agreed to share what little information they had. She explained that Angela had been found abandoned in a remote area, with no identification and no record of her family. The orphanage had taken her in, but the staff reported that Angela often seemed terrified, hiding or speaking in whispers. Over time, she developed a strong attachment to a stuffed bear, which seemed to be her only source of comfort. As Beth listened, her heart ached for the little girl who had endured so much. She thanked Ms. Riley and ended the call, feeling a renewed determination to help Angela heal from the shadows of her past. That night, Beth and Tom sat with Angela in her room, reading her favorite bedtime story. As they finished, Angela looked up at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Mom, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, sweetheart," Beth said gently, reaching out to hold her hand. Angela hesitated, her gaze shifting between her parents. I want to tell you something." Beth and Tom exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Angela took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "When I was little, there were people. They were bad people. They said I couldn't tell anyone, or they would come for me." Beth's heart broke as she listened to her daughter's words, each one heavy with fear and pain. She wrapped her arms around Angela, holding her tightly. No one can hurt you now, Angela. You're safe with us, and no one will ever take you away. Angela buried her face in Beth's shoulder, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Beth held her own tears falling as she whispered words of love and reassurance. She knew that this was only the beginning of Angela's journey to healing, but she was ready to face whatever came their way. As she cradled her daughter in her arms, Beth made a silent vow. She would protect Angela from the shadows of her past, no matter what it took. And for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that, one day, Angela would find peace and safety in the family that loved her. Breaking the silence. The days that followed Angela's revelation were a delicate dance between love and patience. Beth and Tom did their best to create a safe, predictable environment where Angela could heal, but her confession lingered heavily in their hearts. Although Angela had shared a fragment of her past, Beth sensed that the darkness went deeper, a web of memories and fears that Angela herself might not fully understand. Since that night, Angela's nighttime whispers had lessened, yet her attachment to her stuffed bear grew. She carried it with her everywhere, clutching it tightly, as though it were her anchor to the present. Beth understood that the bear had become Angela's shield, a protective barrier between her and the memories that haunted her. One afternoon, Beth decided to take Angela to a nearby park. She hoped the fresh air and open space might help Angela feel more relaxed, more like a child who could play freely without the weight of her past. As they arrived at the park, Beth was delighted to see Angela's eyes light up at the sight of the swings, slides, and climbing frames. Angela hesitated for a moment, clutching her bear, before Beth gently nudged her forward. "Go on, sweetheart," Beth encouraged. "I'll be right here watching. You're safe." Angela looked up at Beth, her gaze filled with a mix of trust and uncertainty, before finally taking small, cautious steps toward the swing set. She sat down on a swing, her grip on the chains tentative, and began to sway gently, her face a picture of concentration. Beth watched her with a soft smile, feeling the surge of hope. Maybe this was a step toward freedom, a way for Angela to find joy in the simple moments of childhood. As Angela swung higher, her face began to relax, her eyes closing as she let the wind whip through her hair. She seemed almost lost in the sensation, her small body swaying back and forth, a faint smile on her lips. But then, as the swing reached its peak, Angela's eyes flew open, and she glanced over her shoulder, a flicker of fear flashing across her face. Beth felt her heart skip a beat. She could tell that Angela was on high alert, her gaze darting around as if she were expecting something, or someone, to appear. Beth stood up and walked toward her daughter, trying to keep her tone light. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft and reassuring. Angela slowed the swing, her small hands gripping the chains tightly. She nodded, but Beth could see the tension in her posture, the way her body seemed poised to flee at the slightest provocation. Beth knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Remember, you're safe here. No one can hurt you. If there's ever anything you want to tell me, I'm here to listen." Angela looked at her, and for a brief moment, Beth saw a glimmer of trust in her daughter's eyes. Angela opened her mouth as if she were about to speak, but then closed it again, her gaze drifting to the ground. Beth sighed, feeling the familiar ache of helplessness. She wanted so desperately to help Angela, to uncover the secrets that haunted her, but she knew that pushing too hard would only drive her daughter further into silence. That evening, after Angela had gone to bed, Beth sat down with Tom at the kitchen table. They talked quietly, their voices hushed as they discussed Angela's progress. "She seems to be doing a little better," Beth said, her tone cautious. "But I can tell she's still holding back. It's like there's a wall around her, and every time we get close, she pulls away." Tom nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "I know. I think we should give her time, but maybe we need to find another way to help her feel safe enough to open up." Beth agreed, but she was unsure of what else they could do. They had already tried therapy, creating routines, and providing constant reassurance. Yet Angela remained guarded, her past lurking like a shadow they couldn't dispel. "Maybe there's a way we can make her feel empowered," Tom suggested after a moment. "If she feels like she has control over her story, she might be more willing to share it." Beth considered his words carefully. Perhaps they had been focusing too much on trying to coax Angela to open up, rather than allowing her to take the lead in her healing journey. She resolved to find a way to help Angela feel safe enough to share her story on her own terms. The next day, Beth decided to try a new approach. She gathered a few art supplies and set them out on the dining room table, hoping that creative expression might allow Angela to communicate without the pressure of speaking. When Angela saw the crayons, markers, and colored pencils, she hesitated, her gaze flickering with curiosity. Beth smiled, patting the chair beside her. "Do you want to draw with me, Angela? We could make a picture together," Beth said, keeping her tone light and inviting. Angela's grip on her bear tightened, but after a moment, she nodded and sat down. Beth handed her a piece of paper and a crayon, and they began to draw side by side, each creating their own picture. Beth drew simple, happy images: a sun, a flower, a butterfly, hoping to encourage Angela to express herself in a way that felt safe. Angela's picture, however, took a different tone. She began to draw dark shapes, shadowy figures that seemed to loom over a small, solitary figure in the corner of the page. Beth's heart ached as she watched her daughter's hand move, each line heavy with emotion. After a few minutes, Angela paused, looking at her drawing with a frown. She glanced at Beth, her expression uncertain, as if seeking approval. Beth reached out, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart. You can draw whatever you want. This is your space." Angela hesitated, then nodded, her gaze returning to the page. She added more details to the shadows, her hand moving with a focus that Beth hadn't seen before. She seemed almost entranced by the act of drawing, her expression intense as she poured her emotions onto the paper. Beth wanted to ask Angela about the figures, to know what they represented, but she held back, sensing that her daughter needed this moment of quiet expression. When Angela finally finished, she sat back, studying her drawing with a thoughtful look. Beth watched her, waiting, her heart pounding as she wondered if Angela might be ready to share something, anything, about her past. After a long silence, Angela looked up, her dark eyes meeting Beth's. She opened her mouth, her voice barely a whisper. They would come at night," Angela said, her words hesitant, each one weighed down by fear. They would say things, scary things. They told me not to tell anyone." Beth's heart shattered as she listened to her daughter's words, each one a glimpse into a nightmare that no child should ever experience. She reached out, taking Angela's small hand in hers, her voice gentle. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Beth whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "No one can hurt you now. You're safe here with us, and no one will ever take you away." Angela's gaze softened, a flicker of relief crossing her face. She clutched her bear tightly, nodding slightly as if trying to absorb Beth's words. "Do you remember anything else, Angela?" Beth asked gently, hoping her daughter might feel comfortable enough to share more. Angela's eyes drifted back to the drawing, her expression guarded. I don't like to remember. It makes me feel scared." Beth felt a pang of sorrow, knowing that the memories were too painful for Angela to confront all at once. She leaned down, wrapping her arms around her daughter in a comforting embrace. "That's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to remember everything right now. Just know that you're safe here, and no one can hurt you anymore." Angela rested her head against Beth's shoulder, her body relaxing slightly as she accepted the comfort. For the first time, Beth felt that they were making progress, that Angela was beginning to trust her enough to let down the walls she had built around herself. That night, Beth and Tom sat with Angela as she drifted off to sleep, their presence a constant reminder of the love and security she now had. Angela clutched her bear, her breathing steady, her face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. As they left the room, Beth whispered a silent promise to her daughter. She would protect her, no matter what memories surfaced, no matter what darkness they had to face. Angela's past might be filled with shadows, but Beth knew that, together, they could build a future filled with light and love. And as she closed the door softly, Beth felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that one day, Angela would be free from the fear that had haunted her for so long. Embracing the light. Weeks passed, each day bringing Angela closer to a sense of safety and trust she had never known. With the gentle support of her parents and Dr. Whitmore, Angela had started to feel a new warmth in her life, one that seemed to gradually soften the fears that had held her captive. But as comforting as the love surrounding her was, there were still moments, fleeting but potent, where shadows seemed to creep back in, triggered by seemingly innocuous things like a creak in the floorboards or an unfamiliar face. Beth had come to accept that healing would be a long journey. There were good days, filled with laughter and trust, and there were difficult days when Angela retreated into herself, her eyes clouded with memories she couldn't yet express. Beth had noticed that Angela was now opening up more through her art, and one evening, after Angela had gone to bed, she went through her drawings. They had evolved. The shadowy figures were fewer, and in some pictures, Angela had drawn bright spots. A sun, a star, or even herself standing in a field of flowers. Each drawing was a milestone, a sign of hope. It was as if Angela was slowly transforming the darkness into something bearable, even beautiful. Beth and Tom, too, had started to dream of a future for their daughter, one where her fears no longer ruled her life. One Sunday morning, Tom suggested a day trip to a nearby lake. It was a peaceful place, lined with trees, and filled with spots perfect for picnicking and swimming. Beth was a bit hesitant, worried that an unfamiliar setting might be overwhelming for Angela, but when they told her about the lake, her eyes sparkled with excitement. She clutched her bear, nodding eagerly, and for the first time in months, Beth saw a glimmer of pure, unguarded joy on her daughter's face. They arrived at the lake by mid-morning, the water shimmering under the warm sun. Beth spread a picnic blanket under the shade of a tree while Tom prepared snacks and drinks. Angela, her bear in hand, walked to the edge of the water, her small figure silhouetted against the lake's gentle waves. Beth watched her from a distance, heart swelling with pride. Angela's shoulders were relaxed, and she seemed captivated by the sight of the water, her reflection wavering on the surface as she dipped her fingers in. After a few moments, she looked back at Beth and Tom, her eyes bright with wonder. Beth joined her by the water, crouching down to Angela's level. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Angela nodded, her expression serious yet full of awe. Can I go in?" Beth smiled, nodding. "Of course. I'll be right here with you." Together, they waded into the water, Beth holding Angela's hand as they stepped in, the coolness of the lake surrounding them. Angela let out a small laugh, her eyes wide with delight as she felt the water lap around her legs. She lifted her arms and spun around, splashing lightly, the bear clutched protectively in one hand. For the first time, Angela seemed free, unburdened by the past. Her laughter echoed across the lake, mingling with the sound of birds and the gentle lapping of the waves. Beth's heart swelled as she watched her daughter, her face radiant and unguarded. After a while, they returned to the picnic blanket, where Tom had laid out a small feast of sandwiches, fruit, and Angela's favorite strawberry lemonade. They sat together, eating and talking, basking in the warmth of the sun. Angela lay on the blanket with her bear, her gaze drifting up to the clouds as she traced patterns in the sky with her finger. Tom, noticing her relaxed expression, decided to ask a question that had been on both their minds. "Angela," he said gently, "what's your bear's name?" Angela looked at him, a slight smile tugging at her lips. She held the bear close, hesitating before she answered. "Hope," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Beth felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes misting over. "Hope. The name was a testament to Angela's resilience, a symbol of the courage it had taken her to survive. "Hope is a perfect name," Beth whispered, reaching out to stroke her daughter's hair. Angela closed her eyes, a small smile gracing her face as she nestled against her mother's side. As the afternoon wore on, Beth noticed Angela's gaze drifting to the woods surrounding the lake. She seemed curious yet hesitant, her eyes flickering between the trees and her parents. "Would you like to go for a walk in the woods?" Beth offered gently. Angela looked up, her expression a mix of excitement and uncertainty. She glanced at her bear, then at the trees, as though weighing a decision. "Yes," she whispered finally, her hand slipping into Beth's. Tom joined them, and they walked together along a narrow path that wound through the forest, the scent of pine and earth filling the air. Angela's eyes were wide with wonder as she took in the towering trees, the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, and the soft rustling of wildlife in the underbrush. As they walked, Angela began to hum softly to herself, a sweet, tentative tune that seemed to blend with the sounds of the forest. Beth and Tom exchanged a look, their hearts swelling with pride. Angela was finally beginning to express herself, no longer confined to whispers or silence. At one point, they came across a small clearing with a patch of wildflowers. Angela's face lit up, and she knelt down, touching the delicate petals with her fingertips. "Beautiful," she murmured, looking up at her parents with a smile that took their breath away. Beth knelt beside her, picking a small daisy and tucking it behind Angela's ear. "Just like you, sweetheart." Angela's cheeks flushed, and she looked down, her fingers brushing over the flower. For a moment, Beth saw a flicker of shyness in her eyes, a softness that was new and vulnerable. But then, as they turned to leave the clearing, Angela froze, her gaze fixed on a shadow cast by a large tree. Her small hand gripped Beth's tightly, her body tensing as she stared into the darkness beneath the branches. "What is it, sweetheart?" Beth asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Angela didn't answer, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched her bear to her chest, her breathing quickening as she took a step back. Beth knelt down, holding her daughter's hand firmly. "Angela, remember, you're safe here. No one can hurt you." Angela looked at her, her lips trembling as she whispered, sometimes, I still see them. In the shadows." Beth's heart broke as she heard the fear in her daughter's voice. She pulled Angela into a tight hug, holding her close. "I know, sweetheart, but those shadows can't hurt you anymore. They're only memories. You're here, in the light with us." Angela's breathing began to slow, her grip on her bear loosening as she clung to her mother. Beth felt the weight of all the unspoken fears that Angela still carried, but she also sensed a newfound strength in her daughter, a strength that came not from forgetting the past, but from facing it. Tom knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both of them. "We're here, Angela," he whispered, "and we'll always be here, no matter what shadows come. We're your family." Angela looked up at them, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. Slowly, she nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Family," she whispered, the word tentative but full of hope. That night, as they drove home, Angela fell asleep in the back seat, her bear clutched tightly to her chest. Beth looked back at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and pride. She knew that Angela's journey was far from over, but she also knew that they had made a breakthrough, a step toward healing that would lead Angela into a future filled with light and love. When they arrived home, Tom carried Angela inside, her small form resting peacefully in his arms. As he tucked her into bed, Beth placed her bear, Hope, beside her, gently tucking the covers around them both. In the quiet of the night, Beth and Tom stood by Angela's bedside, watching their daughter sleep, her face serene and untroubled. "We did it, didn't we?" Tom whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Beth nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes, she's finally found her place. She's finally found her family." And as they left the room, hand in hand, Beth felt a sense of peace, a deep assurance that Angela's life was now filled with the love and security she had longed for. The shadows of her past would always be a part of her, but they no longer held power over her. Angela had stepped into the light, and she was ready to embrace the future that lay before her.